Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Affirm Press. Listeners, I am aware that I have been privileged to speak with some amazing people on this podcast over the last 6 years. People I could never have imagined I would one day meet, let alone have an in-depth conversation with. But therein, I suggest, lies the power of books. Books, like fine wine or whiskey, have the ability to bring people together. And it is with this in mind that I introduce my next guest author to you. She is none other than the lovely Jane Tara, author and wanderer, as well as the general manager of Better Reading, one of Australia's largest online book communities. Jane is the author of more than 100 children's books, several plays, and 5 novels. And recently, Jane's new novel, called Tilda is Visible, was released by Affirm Press. Now, listeners, I'm not sure what I expected when I picked up this book, but whatever expectation or presumption I had was completely surpassed. I was surprised and delighted in the best possible way. This book was original, quirky, funny, and spellbinding. I absolutely adored it. And so it is with such pleasure that I welcome Jane to the podcast this morning. Hi, Jane.
Oh, Claudine, that is such a beautiful intro. Thank you. I'm just sitting there going, thank you. You can do it again. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so delighted to be speaking with you. And I wanted to say congratulations on this wonderful novel. How does it feel to finally have this book out into the world?
It is, well, it's huge. It's really busy at the moment, but I have scheduled everything in a way where I have one day a week where I can sit and savor it as well, and actually take that time to think about what I'm experiencing and how grateful I am and how lucky I am just to be having this. It's a wild ride.
I can only imagine.
And it's been a long time coming because I've been writing for so long, because I had this idea 10 years ago, because the book that I wrote is only because of a long process. So all of those things have come together in this moment, and I'm trying to take the time to actually savor it as well as just kind of get through it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that. And reading it, Jane, it felt like a lifetime of experience went into Tilda's story and her journey towards healing. Is that a fair description?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I had an idea that was very separate from me and I thought would make a good story. But as I went through my own journey over the years and I started to explore the idea of Tilda, the two of us merged in many ways as well, which means also putting it out to the world now. I felt very vulnerable doing so.
Yeah, I bet you did. And I wondered, do you think that you could have written this book at any other time in your life?
No, no. I tried. Well, saying that I tried, she was a character in a story, like a short story 10 years ago, and she was very different. It was set in London and she was a florist and just a completely different character. But the idea of a Tilda who was disappearing was there in that. So I sat with her for a decade and thought, how am I going to come back to this and actually write about her in her own book? And that's what I've done with this. It's taken a long time for me to really get to the point where I think you need to be older to tell Tilda's story.
Indeed. So speaking of Tilda's story, I wondered, for the benefit of listeners who haven't yet read it, could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Tilda is a woman in her early 50s who wakes up one day and her little finger and her ear have disappeared. They're invisible. And she is diagnosed with a condition called invisibility. It is quite common in women over 50. And she goes on the journey of her life to try and not completely disappear. And to do that, she has to face some trauma from her past. And along the way, she meets a love interest, Patrick, who is blind and sees her clearly. I think one of the things about Tilda is that her life is actually quite good. It's a surprise to be diagnosed with something. She's got great friends, a good solid business, a good relationship with her kids. And this comes out of the blue for her. But as she's processing all of this and learning how to face it, she realizes she needs to face her past. And I think that it's a quite a common story for women in their 40s and 50s, where something kind of stops you in your tracks. And sometimes you need to, and we all have a past, and sometimes you need to face that past.
Indeed, such a beautiful story. And I think as a woman of a certain age myself, it's not difficult to understand your motivation for writing this story. But I wondered if there was something that started you thinking about women's invisibility, so to speak, a specific event, or was it more a series of events?
It was a specific event. And I didn't realize, I guess, in my 40s that I'd been feeling invisible. It kind of crept up on me. I think a lot of women have one specific incident where they go, "Oh, what am I, invisible?" And then they go, "Oh, yes, okay, I'm at that age now where I'm being treated in a certain way." For me, I felt invisible. I felt invisible at home, in a relationship that I was in. My needs were invisible. Uh, and so I knew that that was occurring in my life. But then, out of the blue, one day, I was diagnosed with a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa. And it's the condition that Patrick has in the novel. I was told that I was going blind. And I was booked into the Centre for Eye Health at the University of New South Wales for further testing. And the idea of those tests would be to tell me how much sight I'd lost and how much sight I possibly had left. But they couldn't get me into that appointment for 3 months, and just under 3 months. So for that period of time, I actually was living with the possibility, the very real possibility, that I was going blind. And of course, I spent the first few days in bed with a wine bottle beside me, Googling like crazy, a little bit like Tilda does in the novel. Then I went down another rabbit hole about all of these incredible things that are happening in the world around sight, research and experiments that are happening around sight. And also the question of, what does it even mean to see? What does it mean to see? How do we see ourselves? How do we see the world? And as I started to shift into these much bigger and almost metaphysical questions, one day I was looking in the mirror, and that had always been an experience, a daily experience, where I would criticize myself like most women. And suddenly I looked in the mirror and I saw all of my wrinkles and all the aging that was, starting to happen. Mid-40s I was at this time. And I felt nothing but love for all of it. And I thought, oh my God, am I not going to see myself age? And it was like a shift in perception in the way that I saw myself. Now, fast forward a couple of months, some extensive testing. Turned out I didn't have. It was a misdiagnosis. I have a very unusual pattern in my retina that presents as that, but it wasn't that. So it was a great outcome for me, but it left me with this idea around, what does it mean to see? And also, I continued looking in the mirror with much kinder eyes. And the idea of Tilda was born. How do we see ourselves? How can we see ourselves more kindly?
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. I love that story. Thank you for sharing. Talking about how we see ourselves, Tilda could be any one of us. As I was reading, I so identified with a lot of the things that Tilda was thinking about herself. And I was also very fascinated to learn about this other truly invisible character in the book called Pearl. Pearl is quite vocal and can be rather nasty. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Pearl, and where does she come from?
Well, Pearl is our internal program, and I just gave her a name, and it's program everything, always repeat loop. I've discovered that not everyone has an internal program, but most people do. And mine is particularly loud and noisy, but only once I realized she existed. And I think this is the thing, until you don't know that you're being run by this internal program. But once that genie is out of the bottle, there's no shoving it back in. I can remember the night, because I was doing a 6-week meditation and sort of personal growth course with a friend of mine that introduced me to the inner programs, and it's kind of rooted in neuroplasticity. So you can go and change them using mindfulness techniques. And I can remember the night I was standing under a street light on a Sydney street, standing there. It was like an epiphany. I went, oh, wow. I had no idea this was going on inside my head. No idea. I thought I was a fairly relaxed person. I thought I was optimistic. And I think I am optimistic, but I also didn't realize I had this destructive loop going on the whole time. That was actually 9 years ago, and I have been working with meditation and changing the neural pathways of my brain ever since then with various exercises. And I now find that my personal pearl is much kinder, not all the time, but much kinder. And it can be a cheerleader, because your internal programs are just feeding back. They value tag information from your life, and they go, what does this person need to hear? And it might be a loop of fear or negativity, but you can change that program to sort of support you as well. And that's basically what the book is about, and what Tilda goes through on her journey with Pearl. And do you have a Pearl?
I do. I hadn't really thought about it until I was reading this book. And then I thought to myself, I actually do. And it's that inner voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you can't possibly do something, that people will think you're stupid. It's things like that. I just thought that was just the way I saw myself, I guess, but it is actually, yeah, it's that voice that
It
keeps
is the way
telling
you see yourself. Yes, it is. And you wouldn't speak to a friend like that. And yet you speak to yourself like that. And that's what I discovered about myself, that I was cruel. Cruel, and I still can be, because that's the nature of the program. But we can also take control of it more and use it to our advantage. So I see Pearl as kind of a little maybe blue rinse, negative Nelly, like the neighbor who's sticking her head out through the curtains and everything, and she can really nag at me. And she is also very fearful, so she tries to get in my way to stop me from doing anything that could change my life.
Yeah.
Very fearful. So I often have that conversation with her and just say, sit down, Pearl, it's all good, and we're going to go for a more positive sort of way of seeing this experience. So now I've formed a relationship with her, and I think that's a healthier thing to do than let her have a megaphone going at me all the time.
Yeah, I love that so much, Jane. That's just brilliant. And I think we could all do with telling our inner Pearl to just settle down. Just let us get on with things, please. So good.
Form that relationship, and one day she'll turn around, she'll say, you look lovely today. And it's you telling yourself this, you go, she'll say, you look lovely. You'll be looking in the mirror and you'll hear that voice and you think, oh, wow, how far we've come.
So in the book, Tilda learns about Pearl via her therapist, somebody called Dr. Selma Nesta. And this is where the book gets truly fascinating for me. And you've touched on it a little bit, but there are lots of theories and information about the brain and its plasticity, if you will, ways that we can train our brain to change thought processes, reprogramming our brain to help improve our mental well-being. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about this, and where did this all come from? Like, how did you know about this? And where did you learn about it?
So I was first introduced to neuroplasticity. My son was 12. And well, actually a little bit before then, I'd been curious. And once I go down a rabbit hole, I'm, fascinated by something. So I'll do a lot of research, but I'm certainly no expert in the area. But it became important in my life when my son was about 12, 13. I was being called into the school on a regular basis because he just hit high school and he was severely dyslexic and it was impacting his emotional health. And so I researched, as I always do, and I discovered this program called the Arrowsmith program. And it's a woman called Barbara Arrowsmith. She's Canadian and she had studied neuroplasticity, had a science background, had her own brain injuries that she changed, and then created this program for children with learning issues and disabilities. And it's a Canadian program, but it is worldwide now. So I was watching my son slip away emotionally because of the way his brain was working at school. And I decided to just have a complete circuit breaker. And I took him out of school and we traveled for a while, for 3 months. And then I put him into the Arrowsmith program. And so he was tested at the beginning of the process, and I could only afford 9 months. It's very expensive, but at the end of the program, and he went from being severely dyslexic to mildly dyslexic, which he is now, but it absolutely was a complete game changer for him. He was the type of kid who was quite volcanic in his expression and silent otherwise. And about 3 months into the program, I called my mother and I said, I'm about to complain about something I thought I'd never complain about, but Rafi won't shut up. He's just talking all the time. But when I spoke to him about it, it was because these exercises it was like they turned on a switch in his brain. He was able to get all of those thoughts that he had out of his mouth that wasn't happening for him before. So over the course of the 9 months, I saw major changes in him, and the final testing showed that there'd been a lot of changes in his capabilities. Moving forward into my own experience, I thought, okay, I have some real struggles, emotional struggles. How can I change those? And if my 13-year-old son can change his brain, surely I can as well. And it was around this time I discovered the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza and a lot of other people out there teaching mindfulness, meditation, and that neuroplasticity. And so I went on a wild, crazy journey myself that I'm still on and love. Along the way, I thought I'd really love to be reading more fiction about people who are going on this journey. And I couldn't find any of the merging of the self-help and the contemporary fiction. And so I thought, oh, well, I better write one. Yeah.
There's a tip in there for us writers out there.
I wrote what I wanted to read at that time because I love the journey that I've gone on with meditation.
So speaking of meditation, Jane, it's an important part of your life now, and I understand that you practice it regularly. But I think it's fair to say that when we meet Tilda, she doesn't share your enthusiasm for meditation, does she?
Not at all. She has accidentally found herself in a professional world, like her business is actually slightly woo-woo, but that's more because of her business partner than her. She's never asked big questions about her life. She's been a single mum. She just got on with it. And after her divorce and, raised her kids and worked and supported her family, and now has to ask herself some really big questions because she's at risk of completely losing herself.
Yeah, indeed. So talk to me about meditation and how your experiences with meditation helped inform this part of Tilda's journey.
I guess if I could share one thing with the world, it is how incredible your life is when you have a regular meditation practice, when you really commit to it, because you're not committing to meditation, you're committing to yourself. And when you change, your world changes. And en masse, when we do that, the world changes. And I see this in certain programs that are happening around the world. I've been watching a program that's happening at the moment in jails in Central America where all the inmates are meditating. The impact and the ripple effect of that is incredible. But on a personal level, meditation for me, I've always been curious. I was living in Japan in my early 20s and studied it there. I studied it, various different types of it over the decades. I even did the Vipassana meditation retreat, the silent 10-day retreat that Tilda does in the book. And all of that, I found it hard going, but beneficial. I saw the benefits of meditation, but I never really fell in love with the practice. And then I found the meditation style that I currently do. And it such big changes occurred in me and in my life, in just the practice itself and how I feel during that practice, that I wouldn't want to live without it now. It is just non-negotiable in my life. It's so important, and it makes me see the world in a certain way and approach my life in a certain way. But I think for anyone who's listening who is wondering, well, how would I even start? Just start. Just sit down for 5 minutes. That's all it takes, just for 5 minutes. I do an hour most days. Sometimes I only have time for half an hour, but I do an hour most days. But I've built up to that over decades. 5 minutes, sitting in for 5 minutes and taking that time is taking that time for yourself and showing yourself that you're worthy of that, and you're worthy of the reflection, and you're worthy of changing, I guess, and being the best version of yourself.
I guess that's a really terrific segue into my next question. There was one particular part of this book that really struck a chord with me, and that was where Tilda comes to understand that she's denied a really important creative part of herself. And in denying that part of her, she's kind of remained unfulfilled. And it's despite what you said earlier, it's despite the fact that many would describe her as outwardly quite successful. She's got a thriving business. She doesn't really have any money worries. She's got 2 gorgeous daughters with, she's got a great relationship. Her mum's still around and alive, good friends, etc. So outwardly, people would look at Tilda and say she's got a terrific life. And yet it's clear that she has remained unfulfilled. So I wanted to ask you, Jane, why was this something you wanted to explore with the novel, and what inferences can we draw about this for our own lives?
So my first draft, or not the completed draft, but certainly I was well into the draft, and Tilda had some money issues. And I went back and I rewrote that from the beginning. I wanted her to be coming from a place of privilege, really, because the whole point of this is that you still struggle with things, and often success or the life that you've built has come at a price. Sometimes it's because you've supported your family and you've done a very good job at that. But at some stage, you need to face that price as well. For me, this was a novel that I wanted to write. I wanted to write like this. And instead I was writing children's books and children's textbooks, and not even there's some people who want to be writing children's books, but I was writing for rent, we call it. I was writing to meet deadlines so I could support my family. And I absolutely am so grateful I was able to do that. But there was a deep yearning for me to sit down and write a story that it's the creative life. I wanted to sit down and dive into something that was speaking to me. I never took that time for myself. I didn't have that time for myself until recently. I did early on, actually. So Tom in the novel is not my ex-husband or the father of my kids. The father of my children was great. He was great. We divorced, and that kind of sidelined all of this for a while. But when I was with him, I wrote a couple of romance novels, and I enjoyed that immensely and always wanted to go back to writing for myself. So it's about being brave enough and vulnerable enough to really dig into your own creativity and your calling. And I think it's a tool that I use in the novel for Tilda to ultimately see herself again.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. I loved it. It's so interesting to me, Jane, because I'm yet to meet any woman who doesn't have some kind of creative streak or desire to pursue something creative in their life, whether it be perfecting
Mm,
the fluffy scone or sponge or to crochet or to paint or to write. But you're so right. We don't often give ourselves the time to explore these avenues because of what Tilda also feels, that art doesn't pay the rent and our desire for financial security outweighs the need for time to pursue our creative endeavors. But in reading Tilda, I think this is where we go wrong, that we don't
mm,
give ourselves this time.
absolutely. And taking time for ourselves to be creative. And you're right, like everyone has a creative soul. To take time to explore that. And that might be to learn ceramics or to paint or to write, or bake. I know Cheryl is a great cook, and that's where, she's creative. To take that time for yourself, you're better at everything else. You're better at the job. You're better at the relationships. You're a better parent. You have to put yourself first. And we seem to think that that's a selfish thing to do that. But it's what we're here for, to actually work out who we are.
Jane, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
Be kind to yourself. I think you can go into Tilda and read it as entertainment. You can read it as self-help. You can read it as the merging of both. But I think even if someone isn't particularly interested in the like learning to meditate at the end of the book or anything, perhaps they will look in the mirror and just, okay, what can I say to myself today that is like I'm speaking to my best friend? Be your own best friend. Be kind. Be supportive.
Be your own best friend. Absolutely wonderful. Okay, so what's next, Jane? Are you working on something else?
I am.
Can you tell us anything
I,
about it?
I haven't had much time to write, and all of this has been a lot. And
Yeah.
I also had an edit for because Tilda has been picked up in the US, so I had an edit for that. But all of that's done now. So last weekend, after the first crazy week of release, I found it really grounding to have a day at home, and I sat down, I wrote another 1,000 words on the novel I'm working on. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. And it is a multi-generational story, and it is about the stories that we tell ourselves. All I can say at the moment, because I'm still working it out.
Fair enough, too. Fair enough. So, Jane, you're no stranger to books and publishing. You've been involved in better reading now for quite some time, and obviously, a multi-published author. I wondered if working with better reading has helped your journey to publishing, Tilda, in the sense that you're obviously more aware of the publishing landscape, or was this your pure serendipity?
I feel that, and this is where I sound incredibly woo woo, but I feel like the universe unfolds in certain ways. And I'd already written a lot of Tilda, but I had really committed to my self healing and meditation process. And it's like the universe dropped better reading onto my lap.
Yeah.
And it put me in the middle of an industry that I was just able to watch and work out where the novel actually would best fit, because
Yeah.
we have great publishers in this country. They're
Yeah.
fantastic. And so often and I know I've done this in the past, you take a novel out or you take a book out and you're happy for it to go anywhere, because it is just such a privilege to be published and to sign that contract. But I think also each place that you put your book, the book can be different. It's
Yeah.
delivered in a different way. It's edited in a different way. So I wanted to find the place where it fit really well. And that was definitely with Kelly Doust at Affirm, because she does contemporary women's fiction and she does self-help. And so
Ah,
with
yes.
this as the merging of both of those, I knew that she'd really understand the story. And of course she has. It gave me this, working at Better Reading gave me the opportunity to, I know the publishers, and I knew it would be look, I would have been happy with anywhere, of course. But I knew it would be a particularly good fit with Kelly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I love that. And I read somewhere that you were, in fact, rejected by Affirm a long time ago, but there's some serendipity in the date on which you were rejected and the date that this
Oh,
novel
yes.
came out.
So it wasn't Affirm. It was actually Kieran Rogers. He's one of the co-owners of Affirm.
Yeah.
And so it was his first job in publishing. I think it was Hachette, or I can't remember the publisher on it. But so a couple of months ago, I was doing some decluttering. I love a good declutter. And I found a folder that had some old rejection letters from the days when you would send them out by mail, and get the rejection letters back by mail. And it was for a children's book. And I was going through them. There were about a dozen. I thought, I wonder if I know any of the names on these rejections. And I went through and I didn't until the very last rejection letter. And it was signed off by Kieran. So I took a photo of it and sent it to him. I said, check this out. And actually the children's book was Molly and the Hall of Mirrors. But he'd written on it Molly and the Hall of Horrors. So I don't know whether it was a really bad book or whether that was an in-joke at the publisher going, oh, my God, this is shocking. Just reject. Anyway, so he signed it off. We're not going to give you a contract for Molly and the Hall of Horrors. But the date at the top was the 27th of February, 2001. And Tilda and his company, Affirm, published Tilda exactly 23 years later. So I thought that was incredible synchronicity there. So I sent it to him, but he made a really great point. I said, this shows it's a great lesson for writers to not give up, just to keep going.
Yeah.
It's a numbers game. Your time is going to come. Keep going. And he emailed back a great point. He said, also for anyone young in publishing who's doing the dirty work for other people and rejecting everything for someone else, your time will come too, because he worked his way up and now he gets to make the choices with his own company about what types of books are going to be published. So it was excellent. Well, I took a photo of him at a recent event and published the article about that as well. So, yeah.
I just loved that story so much. He's right, or you were right, in the sense that, and I think you told me this when we met, was it the HarperCollins event back in August of last year? And you were just like, keep going. It's a numbers game.
You keep going and just don't give up. Don't give up. It will happen. Absolutely will happen. I think people are looking at what's happening with Tilda at the moment. I'm having it's amazing support. I'm so blessed.
Yeah.
But I've been writing now for decades. So, yeah, I really look forward to going to your book launch.
I so appreciate that. I can't tell you what that means. Thank you. So we've been talking about how many people that you know in the publishing industry, and you understand the experiences that many writers have had on their publishing journey. So with that in mind, Jane, I wondered if you could offer 3 tips to other writers out there who are trying to pursue their dream of seeing their book on a shelf one day.
Patience. And that is the process with yourself and what everyone's on their own journey. Everyone's on their own path, and the path unfolds in front of you. Particularly with writing something, have patience with that process, with that creative process with yourself. And then, if you're blessed enough to end up being published, have patience with that as well. It's all a very long process. So patience is a big one. I would say really be as vulnerable as you can. And I found that difficult, but I went back and kept doing some loops of Tilda in the editing process before I let anyone read it. And each time I put more of myself into her until, honestly, we know she's me. Tilda is me. There's a lot of differences in Tilda's life, but I put, key experiences into her that are my own, and I felt incredibly vulnerable doing so. But I think that's why it's resonating with people. So, take courage, be brave, really put yourself into it. And I think I mentioned this on another podcast. One of the key things that I do at the moment is sometimes we can overcomplicate things when we're writing it and the story. And I'll just take a breath and I'll sit back and I'll go, okay, keep it simple. What am I trying to say here?
Yeah.
Let's keep it really simple.
Yeah.
So simplicity.
Terrific tips. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jane. What can I say? It has been a complete pleasure and honor to chat with you about this fantastic book. It's a must read for all women. So I really encourage listeners out there to find it, download it, borrow it, or buy it. And Jane, thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Claudine, this podcast is brilliant. It is such a great listen for any authors, aspiring authors out there. I was absolutely thrilled to get the request to be on it because you speak to so many great authors that I was like, oh yes, I get to talk to her too. So thank you for reaching out and for taking the time as well today. I've just loved chatting to you.
The pleasure is all mine, my friend, let me assure you. That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.